Good afternoon. My name is Ben Schneider. I teach in the Political Science Department. And I welcome to all of you to this edition of the STAR Forum, sponsored by the Center for International Studies and the MIT Brazil program. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Minister Celso Amorim to MIT. Minister Amorim had a long and very successful career in the Foreign Service in Brazil, Itamar as it's known, and culminating in several top-level appointments as Minister of Foreign Relations in the 1990s, again Minister of Foreign Relations in the 2000s, throughout the full length of the two administrations of President Lula, and then Defense Minister in the government of Dilma Rousseff. At the end of his time as Foreign Minister in 2009, the Foreign Policy magazine named him the best Foreign Minister. And it came at the end of this long stretch, and this article and others really noted that Brazil in that period, 2003 to 2010, shifted from a major regional power in South America to really a global power and player on the international stage. And the book and Minister Amorim's remarks relate several experiences in the Middle East and in international trade negotiations. But I also was very struck at the time watching this new pivot happen at how Brazil really engaged Africa in this period of the 2000s, again with soft power and diplomacy. Welcome, Minister. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be here in MIT. All the more so because it was also not only a kind invitation by Ben Schneider, but also an idea that came originally from the Noam Chomsky and his wife, which is something I'm extremely honored. I think the best publicity for my book is really the endorsement by Noam Chomsky. And maybe I should even read the book, just read the endorsement, and I would be happy. I'll speak more a little bit about what the book meant, but let me start with something that Professor Schneider just said. It is true that in 2009, it was really an article, because the way that it was published, it gives the impression that there was a big competition, international competition and votes. And it was an article by David Rothkopf, who is now the editor, by the way, of, I believe still he's the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. I didn't know him at the time, so I must say that. He probably knew me to some extent. He had followed the trade negotiations and some other things, and Brazil just had won the right, I think, to host the Olympic Games. So many things that were in mind. And he wrote an article, a piece called "The World's Best Foreign Minister." Well, the interesting thing about that, because that also appears in the book to some extent, people will see that one of the big characters in the book is the media, the Brazilian media especially. All politicians have problems with the media, but I think in our case, this was especially the case. There was not much goodwill in relation to the foreign policy that we're trying to develop. So it's their right to think so. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. But the interesting thing is that I gave an interview just 3 or 4 months after that article appeared. And it was a very good interview by one of the most conservative papers in Brazil. Very respectable ones, very respected actually, called O Estado de São Paulo. And the journalist asked many questions about Iran, and the Middle East, and South America, or the Doha Round, and so on. In the end, he said, to what fact, I mean, to what do you attribute the fact that you were chosen? I was not chosen, but that you were chosen as the world's best foreign minister. I said, why the Foreign Policy magazine did that? I said, well, I mean, remember a little bit the film Casablanca. I said, they were misinformed. They didn't read the Estado de São Paulo. So that was the main reason why I got the distinction, I think. You remember Casablanca film when people say why did you come to Casablanca? And then Humphrey Bogart says, for the waters. And then say, how come? We are in the desert. Oh, I was misinformed. So that's more or less the same. Anyway, I will try to very quickly speak about, this book is composed about 3 narratives. But I think they are significant in relation to what we did and what we tried to do during President Lula's government especially. I had been foreign minister before, during Itamar Franco's for 1.5 years, so I could, I have an idea of what we should do, if ever. I never thought of that really, but I mean, what Brazil should do, and I became foreign minister when President Lula invited me, basically because he wanted someone who belonged to the diplomatic career and not just a politician. But at that time, I think Brazil was in a very interesting situation in which the self-esteem of the country was getting very high. We had been able to overcome the 2 big deficits that we had in the past, the democratic deficit at the time, because Brazil had 21 years of military government in which many initiatives, whatever you think about the military governments, I have my own thoughts, but anyway, whatever you think, initiatives in international relations are very difficult to take, except in the region, the most immediate things that you needed, some things in economic terms, but with a lot of restrictions and inhibitions. The second one was the question of economic stability. When I was foreign minister of the first time, I was about 51 years old. I had never lived a period with inflation of 1 digit, never. It was normally, I mean, the minimum I remember, at least in my mind, was 15%. And very often, of course, we had 2 digits, 3 digits, and towards the end of Sarney's government, even 4-digit inflation. So that's how I thought. So that was one big deficit also, this macroeconomic stability deficit. And that was also overcome some years later after the democratization. So you had these 2 big, let us say, deficiencies of the Brazilian political system which were overcome at that time. There was a third big deficiency, I think, when you think of Brazil as a whole. It was inequality. Brazil is a very unequal, still is a very unequal country, and that applies to class, race, gender. So it's general, but it's very strong. I think it's not a particular characteristic of Brazil alone. I mean, most of Latin America is like that, but in Brazil it's especially acute. I mean, if you compare, for instance, with a country like Uruguay or some others, these inequalities are more striking. And when Brazil elected a metal worker as president, and with a program that he had already in mind, it was clear that combating inequality would be one of the main purposes of the government. So although, let us say, this was still something to happen, we were in the course of actually also combating inequality. So the combination of these 3 things, I mean, the fact that we became democratic, the fact that we had a relatively stable macroeconomic situation, and the fact that we elected a government whose main objective was combating inequality, gave the country a new consciousness of itself. And also, to some extent, the fact that a metal worker became president, which would not be an obvious thing in a country which is so unequal with so many discrimination, also gave a sense that what really was, what here was said by President Obama, yes, we can. So yes, we can, and it is possible. So I think this factor, I'm mentioning these psychological factors because in the past, and I had read that criticism before, Brazil was seen, generally speaking, as a country that, and I'm using now an expression of Jorge Castañeda, someone with whom very often I disagreed, but that was an interesting quote from, he said that Brazil is a country that punches below its weight. So, and I myself had experienced that in my diplomatic career. I was minister of Itamar Franco. It was very much a transition government. I think he did good things, including in foreign policy. We concluded some of the Mercosur treaties, especially the one of the institutionalization, and had some good initiatives. But in any case, it was just 1.5 years. But now it was something different. It was a new president elected by a very big majority in the midst of hope. So I had the impression that we would be able to do things that in the past we were not wishing even, were not willing to do. I was ambassador in the United Nations, I was ambassador in Geneva for the trade negotiations, but also for the other subjects. And also I had a period as ambassador in London. But in many of these cases, what I felt very often is that the instructions I would receive from Brasilia, from the government, were not so much that contrary to what I was proposing. Sometimes it was. Sometimes they were more timid. But very often they said, no, you can do that. But don't be hyperactive. Avoid being protagonic. Avoid appearing too much because you can irritate others, and we should not. You should not irritate the Americans, should not irritate the Europeans, because after all, these were the countries or group of countries with whom we had stronger relations. So I think this is the important thing, because what this book is about are 3 episodes in which Brazil tried not only to act in the region, but globally. But having said that, I also have to point out that the 2 things are very linked. I think at the same time that Brazil tried to, and I may speak very briefly about these different aspects, try to be more present in the world scene, both in trade and in security matters, peace and security matters. At the same time, also we were reinforcing the integration of South America. The government of President Lula, well, he didn't invent the process of integration, but he reinforced that very much and gave a lot of attention. I remember once, again, a journalist in the beginning of the government, 1 year or so, there are many negotiations going on, the FTAA and other things, and you would say, why do you give so much attention to South America? And I had to say, well, because I live here. If I lived somewhere else, I would give attention to another place, but I live here, so I have to give attention to this place. And so there was a lot of emphasis on the integration of South America. And I'm saying South America on purpose because although in our constitution we speak about Latin America, and of course Latin American and Caribbean integration is a long-term goal, in operational terms it would be very difficult to work out, especially at the time in which there was this ongoing negotiation for a broader free trade area of the Americas, which included the United States and Canada as well. So, when we came to office, we had many challenges. One of them was this FTAA, which had been already I don't want to go in all detail because this is very boring. Trade negotiations are something it's very good, very interesting for those who are participating, but for other people it tends to be very boring because of too many details. But the free trade area of the Americas had been launched some years before, and it was more or less almost in a pre-conclusion phase, and many things had been negotiated. In my opinion, many of these things were very unfavorable from the point of view of Brazil. I mentioned one thing, which is very, in my opinion, very striking, which is a subject which I'm involved nowadays also, which is the relation between intellectual property and public health. We had obtained in the past, actually at the moment of the launching of the Doha round, nowadays famous, it's quoted even in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, you had obtained the consolidation of some flexibilities for developing countries in relation to the possibility of using compulsory licensing or not granting patents, to use generic medicines in case of public health needs like HIV/AIDS, which Brazil was actually one of the first. Actually, this started in the previous government, so it's credit to their credit. But it was one of the developing countries probably the developing country that had a quicker and stronger reaction to HIV/AIDS, and that was only possible by the use of widespread use of generic drugs. So that was a very important thing to us, and that would not be maintained in the free trade area of the Americas. I don't comment the free trade of the Americas in this book, but I'm just mentioning that because that was the first big challenge that we had to face. And people, they would ask, well, Brazil has to make its offer in goods and so on. I say, no. We have to think about it. And actually, at a certain point, we were able to negotiate a conceptual framework that seemed reasonable. But when we got there, I think the U.S. lost interest in the negotiation, had other priorities as well, so it didn't go on. With the benefit of hindsight, at the time I would have concluded if the U.S. had accepted and continued on that, and other countries as well, I mean, not only the U.S., but I mention the U.S. because it's the most important one, and the one that led the initiative, I would have concluded the agreement. But in hindsight, I think it's better that we failed, actually, because when I see what's happening to Mexico now, and the dangers and the threats that exist, we have lots of problems in our, of course, foreign trade, but this one we don't have. I mean, we're not dependent on preferences on the U.S. market. So this is something that, and at the time there were other reasons as well. So I put a lot of attention on integration of South America. We were able to create something for the first time in 200 years of independent life, a South American organization, the UNASUR. We moved to have not exactly an organization, but at least a forum of the whole Latin American and the Caribbean, which was not against having the continuing working with the OAS. On the contrary, we worked with the OAS, the Organization of American States, but I think it was important that the developing countries of the hemisphere would be able to meet among themselves, and that had never happened, never happened. You only spoke of South America actually when you dealt with football, soccer, because then the South American League, the South American Championship, and so on. Otherwise, you'd speak of Latin American and Caribbean. We wouldn't speak Caribbean, you say Latin America, but in reality, all the important organizations were at the level of the hemispheric level, which corresponded maybe to the reality of previous times. I mean, in the area of security, for instance, when the treaties were established for the Organization of American States, especially the security treaties, it was the time of the Cold War, so it doesn't have any concrete and important meaning at this later time. So these were the changes that were taking place in Brazil. I mean, the economy started to grow again, and not only that, but also the income distribution became more effective. And that was something that was felt almost immediately. And also, I would say, so that's the internal subjective perception, but also outside Brazil, in the first trips of President Lula, I remember his first international trip, he went to Davos, having come from Porto Alegre, where you have the social forum, so trying to, not to be a radical that say, well, I'll not talk to business people, or I'll not talk to the developing countries, not that idea, but on the other hand say, well, yes, we talk to them, but I have my objectives, which are those that imply social change, more independence, and so on. And immediately, I would say, I can testify to that, that was not my work, that's the value of Lula himself. He became a kind of international figure that everyone wished to take a photo with Lula, right and left, especially on the right, because I think it was good for their own image. Is it Noam and Valeria who are coming? Yes, so thank you. So it's a great honor to have Noam Chomsky in my talk today. Thank you. So, so the perception outside was that Lula was such a figure, also because in Latin America he represented something new, something that meant, at least it was seen this way, and to a large extent, in my opinion, that happened, social reform, more equality in a democratic process. He would, of course, talk a lot with the other trade union leaders and the peasants and so on, but he would also talk to business people very often. And so that and he was a full supporter of democracy. All the parties were functioning well. There was no idea that he would use the military or whatever force to impose some social measures. And so that made a very, Lula a leader that was very much sought for, up to the point that I coined even a phrase. I said, well, he had invitations for every and said the demand for Lula, the demand for Lula is much bigger than the supply of Lula. So we have to have a balance here and to have to make some choices. And in making those choices, of course, he didn't refuse to come to rich countries. He made 2 important visits to the United States. For instance, one, people give a lot of attention to state visits, and of course they have a lot of symbolism, but we had a meeting that took about, I would say, all in all, 5-6 hours in Camp David, which is not normal, and that was a working meeting all the time, and that with President Bush. Well, he launched initiatives with President Chirac, who again, it's a center-right politician in Europe, but because Chirac wished to be associated with the ideas of Lula of combating hunger and poverty. So that made him, so that soft power, so to say, that was implicit in his personality was something very important. But also, as I said, he gave a lot of attention also and tried to accept the invitations and sometimes even invite himself, I would say, to other countries of the South. Just 2, 3, or 4 quick examples, because I think that for South America, as I said, in the first year of Lula's government, all the presidents of South America had been to Brazil. Some of them 3 or 4 times, but at least once, all the presidents, and including Suriname and Guyana, which normally were not, or turned to the other Caribbean countries, so all of them. And in a little over 2 years' time, Lula had visited all South American countries. That had never happened in the Brazilian history before. Another aspect of that was seeking for new alliances and partnerships with the African countries and with the Arab countries, for instance. In relation to the African countries, let me just say that when we got in government, I think Brazil had 17 embassies in Africa. When we left, it's about 35 or so. And you know, to see how distorted the view sometimes in Brazil is, in the elite in Brazil, I read a comment with a critical content saying that, well, now with this, after the impeachment, trying to change this policy, so Brazil has more embassies than Germany. Well, it's not clear to me that Germany has more than half of its population of African origin. So this is a total, so Brazil is the biggest, you have the biggest African population in the world after Nigeria, of population of African origin. Of course, there's a lot of mixture, of course, so that would be already a natural thing. There are I've been defense minister afterwards, so there are lots of other reasons to have a very strong policy with Africa, including it from security point of view. I mean, if you take the the westernmost part, the easternmost part of Brazil to Africa, to the place in Africa, from Recife or Natal to Dakar in Senegal, it's a 4-hour flight. I mean, I had made that. The first time I made it in a plane without a toilet. So it was really a big challenge. And I said, well, my autonomy more or less the same of the plane. So I was sure that we had to arrive there in 4.5 hours. So this distance is bigger than the distance between this same city and the easternmost part of Brazil. So it's really, when we speak of the South Atlantic in Brazil, which is totally a political reality, a geopolitical reality, which is totally different from the North Atlantic. There's no NATO, and there's nothing like NATO, and shouldn't be. It is, so we want a zone of peace and cooperation. That, again, it would be another important reason for having a strong relation with Africa. And there was also good business to be made. So everything went together. I once in Harvard here, I met an African professor called Celso Amorim. Some of you may know him. And he said something which I said, well, if I were still the minister, I would put that as a motto in our cooperation agency. He said, for every African problem, there is a Brazilian solution. I think that's maybe too kind, and the way things are going now, I would not recommend some of our solutions. But anyway, but in any case, in terms of technical assistance, agriculture, many of these other things, small agriculture, many other things, we had a very strong cooperation with Africa. But not only Africa, the Arab world. And again, I mean, one of the reasons is so many people of Arab origin in Brazil. The first time I went to Lebanon, when I was Minister Itamar Franco, it was the Lebanese who pointed out to me, a Lebanese minister, that there are twice as many Lebanese in Brazil as in Lebanon. Of course, that counts with, of course, of people of mixed marriages and so on. But in any case, it's a great number, a big number of people. And of course, it's an important region of the world, and we created the first forum of South America Arab countries. And we try to do everything with South America because we wished also to give let us say, a kind of external personality to South America. Instead of doing Brazil, Arab countries, Brazil, Africa, we did South America, Arab countries, South America, African countries, apart from individual initiatives. So all these, I mentioned on a third initiative, if I may, and then I mentioned very quickly the three narratives. A third very important initiative, the second day of government in Brazil, I received the foreign minister of South Africa, Nkosazana Zuma, actually first wife of President Zuma. I even one day asked someone, maybe I'm being indiscreet, at the time of Zuma also he had 4 wives. Said, no, at the time of Nkosazana it was only her. But anyway, that's maybe why they divorced, I don't know. But anyway, Nkosazana Zuma came to Brazil for the inauguration of President Lula, and she, well, talking together, we came to the idea that it would be interesting to have a coordination between developing countries. And instead of having 7 or 8 or 10 developing countries, which is very complicated to coordinate and have different views, we thought of creating a new forum. It's not an organization as such, but a new forum involving India, Brazil, and South Africa. That has historic reasons, but the most important reason is, of course, these were 3 developing countries which were democratic, pluricultural, pluri-ethnical, and one in each continent of the developing world. So the creation of this forum, IBSA, aroused a lot of attention from many people. The Russian foreign minister, for instance, at the time, Igor Ivanov, would very often come to me and say, well, why can't Russia participate in IBSA? And I said, well, at the time it was called the G3. I said, no, well, because, I couldn't give the only real reason. I said, no, we can do a G3 plus 1, but let us keep the identity of the G3. And China would come also. I was recently reading some notes I had written long ago with President Hu Jintao, and in the end of the meeting, he makes a totally gratuitous praise of IBSA. I said, well, why is he praising IBSA? I don't know. And we know that they approach more often South Africa to be part of it. In the end, what is BRICS? BRICS is the 3+2, in a way. Personally, I think IBSA should have and still has, but should be emphasize its own personality within BRICS. But BRICS was a very important factor also in reorganizing the world stability, so to say, or the world order, especially in economic matters. I mean, for years and years and years, developing countries tried to change the quota system in the World Bank and the IMF to no avail. And it was after the creation of BRICS in the G20, the leaders G20, that this was accepted in 2010. And then only after really we created the BRICS Bank that actually the US Congress approved a small change in the quotas of the IMF and the World Bank, because of course it appeared as an alternative, and I think they thought, well, better to reform a little bit at least. So it's more or less like when you have a trade union and then they say, well, let's give a small increase in the pay. That's what happened. So this is very important in all these meetings of the G20, speaking of the leaders of the G20, of course, at some point, now I think it's different because Brazil is in a big recession, Russia has its own problems and so on, China decelerated. But at some point, maybe, of course, I'm biased, and maybe my eyes capture more of what is favorable, I don't know, but I remember the Financial Times giving more attention to the meeting of finance ministers of the BRICS than to that of the G7. Maybe one day or two, I don't know. But anyway, even if it was equal attention, that was already something of great importance. So all these changes that happen in the world and allowed Brazil also to participate not only in its region, and we made a very big effort to keep the region in a peaceful state. I mean, we were very much criticized, for instance, by the Brazilian press by making concessions to Bolivia and making concessions to Paraguay, make concessions to small countries in our region. And at the same time, we were criticized also when we had to stand up to the United States or to Europe in negotiations. And we did, although we have very good partnerships as well. I mean, and I can explore that later on. But these three narratives that I have, one is about the Doha round. The other one is about our relations with the Arab world and with Israel. Let me say that. And Lula was the first president to visit Israel. So first Brazilian president to have a state visit to Israel. I visited Israel 5 times during my period in office. So it's not that we, I didn't do it on purpose, but it was exactly the same number of times that I visited the West Bank, Palestine. So, this is the second narrative. And the third narrative has to do with the Iranian nuclear program. I'm mentioning them exactly in the opposite order because it's easier to understand how, because that's how it happened in reality. In the question of the Doha round, I think Brazil led a group, also called G20, at the time that didn't exist, the other G20 of leaders, which in the meeting in Cancun, in the conference, a ministerial meeting of the WTO in Cancun, was able to stop an agreement that would be very unfavorable to developing countries. And after that, we not only continued to defend our positions, let us say, in a more resistant way, but also with proposals. And our proposals, for instance, in terms of agriculture, became the kind of framework that allowed the negotiations to proceed for some time. So there are some different points and different stages in these negotiations. Cancun was one of them. Then we had the meeting in Hong Kong, in which for the first time we had a precise date. It was not respected in the end, but anyway, it is being now. First time we accept the idea that export subsidies, which is a kind of the nuclear weapons in trade, export subsidies for agriculture would be terminated by a certain date. And that was something that was a great victory of developing countries. People used to say first, oh, no, one thing is Brazil and India, which are big countries. Another thing is Tanzania or whatever. No, all of them came together. We put all these countries together. There is a photo in my book which has Brazil, India, but there is also Mauritius, Zambia in the same photo. I mean, the people who were living there. It's almost, when I saw that, actually I just make a parenthesis to say how it happened. At a certain point, we said there was a group of let us say the poorest people, or poorer or more vulnerable or smaller, which are what's called the G90. And there was the G20, which involved countries like India, Brazil, Argentina, but also did include Tanzania and some others. But anyway, and so we decided to have a meeting together. The idea is to have only a group of small group of leaders, of representatives of other groups. That was in Hong Kong. It was a big room. And suddenly, it was an invasion of the room, not only by, let us say, the leaders of one of this group, but everyone. And that was something which for me was very telling, because I had been ambassador in the old GATT. It's a very much of an Anglo-Saxon club, who everyone speaks to one another in first-name basis, and with great lack of respect for those who don't count. And then we had these people who were really like, you could say, the wretched of the earth, if you can say, in the Frantz Fanon expression, coming back to the room. And because of this unity, we were able to at least have this achievement, which is one of the few achievements that apparently is being kept, which the termination. Of course, that's not the whole story, but it's part of the story. So Doha was like that. And I would just another aspect that I would like to mention, in all these negotiations, not only trade, but in trade it's very much like that, you have these kind of concentric circles of negotiation. You have a nucleus, then it gets a larger group, and then a larger group. The nucleus of negotiations in the old GATT, and even in the beginning of the WTO, used to be what they call the Quad. The Quad was the United States, European Community, then European Union, Canada, and Japan. Because of what we did in Cancun, and because of the unity in developing countries and their capacity, we continue to have a kind of group, because that's inevitable, but instead of the Quad, we had something called the G4. And the G4 was the United States, the European Union, Brazil, and India, instead of Canada and of course, Brazil and India were not there on their own merits, but also because they represented a large part of the world economy. Why China was not is another story, because China was a relatively new member in the WTO, so they were a bit shy. They didn't want to get very involved in these negotiations. So that is the story that I tell in Doha. And I also tell the story of how close we were to an agreement in July 2008. And it was very unfortunate that we were not able to. I'm not a free trader. I'm not one of it. But I thought the negotiations in the WTO, because they are multilateral, because they have more balance between different kinds of countries, are much better than negotiations of the kind of what they call the mega trade agreements like the TPP. And I mean, I have to agree on that point with the present administration here. I mean, the TPP would be bad. I think it would be bad for the United States, actually. I mean, I participated 1 year ago in a seminar in the New School, in which there were many American economists, professors, and so on, who were critical, and it would be very bad also for the rest of the world. And not to go into details again, but I think one mistake, big mistake, I think the Obama administration made from my point of view, I don't know, was to interrupt this effort in the multilateral trade and substitute and replace it by these mega regional agreements, which of course fragment the world trade and of course made it more difficult for developing countries to express their voices. Because of course one thing is Vietnam or whatever, another country, I don't know, Malaysia maybe, if it is dealing together with Brazil or India or China. The other thing is if it is alone, or to take from Latin America, Colombia or Venezuela would not negotiate. But anyway, Colombia or Peru to negotiate with the United States. The other thing is if it's in the whole set, in a broader set. And I think this is a really regrettable thing. And also, I mean, I could go into technical details, but some of the worst things that happen in the world trade, like agricultural subsidies, which cause havoc, not only for Brazil, but in Africa. I mean, Brazil had worked very closely to some African countries called the Cotton Four, which cannot afford competition with the US Treasury. I mean, they can plant good cotton, but how can you afford to be competitive in relation to the US or to the European Union Treasury, for that matter? So these are things that can only be solved in a multilateral agreement. It's impossible. Even if we wish, if the United States government or the Brussels decided to make a liberal step, it won't be possible because they can't do that without the others doing the same thing at the same time. So anyway, so when I think about these are also the fragmentation, I think it's not only a trade matter with trade or economic implications, but it is also a geopolitical matter because if you fragment the world, you'll be working against what was achieved after the Second World War, which, for good or for bad or imperfect as it is, it was, let us say, a world relatively based on multilateral rules. The two other narratives, one has to do with the Middle East. I already mentioned our proximity with the Arab world. We made this first ever meeting of South America and Arab countries. The first meeting took place in Brasilia, and there was very strong pressure. Actually, even I had good relations with Condi Rice, for instance, and she was asking to participate, or not her directly, but even she mentioned to me, but some of the asking can't the United States participate as an observer? And then even the Brazilian press immediately asked the same thing, the United States can't participate as an observer. I said, yes, it's a public meeting. So turn on the television and observe. So that's how we should, but it's our meeting. You have to do our meeting, our things. So, but that was something that annoyed many people. But that was very important also to make Brazil, and contrary to what people in the Brazilian elite thought, that enhanced the value of Brazil in the eyes even of the United States. For the first time ever, we were invited to participate in a very important meeting that took place in Annapolis, near Washington, where the naval base is, in which Brazil, India, and South Africa, quite a coincidence, the IPSA countries, were the only non-Islamic country. Well, India has a very important Islamic population also, but not majority Muslim population that were of developing world that were inviting to the meeting. There were all the European donors, which give money, of course, and then there were, of course, the United States, the permanent members of the Security Council there, and Brazil, India, and South Africa. So because they thought that we could have a role. And I think this was the perception. And because of that, we got very involved in all these, and we tried in many, many moments this to help. I mean, personally, sometimes I brought message from Bashar al-Assad to Omert, and vice versa. Netanyahu asked President Lula, but of course it fell to me, and I was there to go to Syria to reinitiate negotiations on the Golan Heights. So there was a confidence that Brazil could be able. And the Tehran, well, and that process I made in the book I called this Ramallah, because it culminated when we thought that really the policy, especially the policy in relation to settlements, made it impossible to continue the negotiation. We decided to recognize the state of Palestine. And I think we did that not, the same spirit that 2 or 3 years later the Pope received Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of Palestinian Authority. In the case of the Iranian nuclear program, again, there are many technical aspects. I probably leave them because I think it's whoever is interested can read in the book. But again, that started with a request by President Obama to President Lula. When we were in a meeting in L'Aquila, in Italy, just after an earthquake that was there, they were meeting with the G8, and there was the practice, which was discontinued since then, I believe, to have these G8 plus 5 meetings. So it was the G8, including Russia then, G7 plus Russia, and then 5 developing countries, including China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico. In this G8, so Brazil was always invited for this meeting. And during that big conference, whose main subject was climate, because we were looking into Copenhagen, 2009, November, December of 2009, President Obama asked for having a bilateral meeting with President Lula, which of course we accepted very gladly. And the main subject was not climate change, as we thought it would be, it was Iran. And in relation to Iran, President Obama said 2 or 3 things, which, of course, the new importance of the nuclear program. He emphasized that he had reached out to Iran and had not been corresponded by Khamenei, which is correct, actually, by the way, by the supreme leader, which resisted any. And he said, that was very important, he said, the United States, I need to have friends who can talk with people that I cannot talk, referring precisely to how Brazil. There was a visit of Ahmadinejad, which was already scheduled to take place in Brazil. So, and 1 month later, or 2 months later, I received an invoice from the State Department, very high-level invoice, explaining in detail what then had been already proposed by the US and the G5+1, which was the 5 permanent members plus Germany, had proposed to, but under the leadership of the United States, had already proposed to Iran, which was what they call the swap agreement. It's very complicated, I think, to say in a few words, but let me try to do it. Iran was already enriching uranium at 3%, which is low enriched uranium, but of course you can always enrich it more. So the idea was to exchange this low enriched uranium that already existed in Iran for fuel that Iran needed for its research reactor. The research reactor, the word research sometimes may elicit other things, but it's for where you do medical isotopes. So I think it's very important even for treatment of cancer and so on. So that was the proposal. And the Iranians at first seemed that they would agree, and then they went back and they decided not to do it. So Brazil and Turkey, it was not Brazil alone, spent about 6 or 7 months trying to convince Iran to accept that. Long process, many ups and downs. We had a difficult conversation with President Obama here in a meeting that took place in Washington. But just after that, when I thought, well, I don't think this will work because they are not now, President Obama wrote a letter to President Lula, and as we learned, the same letter was sent to then Prime Minister Erdogan, suggesting that we should go on, that the United States continue to be interested in the swap agreement with the same elements that had been proposed in the beginning, which involved really 1,200 kilos of low enriched uranium, the fact that it would be put in a kind of escrow outside Iran, and that would take place immediately. So there were 3 very material things, 3 very easy to to verify quantity, time, and space. I'm not a physicist, but I can't think of anything more material than quantity, time, and space. So this is what we obtained from Iran. Brazil and Turkey working together with a very long process of persuasion, what Iran was having, and that was like a confidence-building gesture. Well, because the internal politics here in the United States had changed, and also because in the meantime, the United States, for reasons that until I only speculate in the book, but I think it's interesting to speculate about that, had also obtained the support of China and Russia for sanctions. When we got the agreement, they were no longer interested, which led people like El-Baradei, who had been the director of the atomic agency, had won the Nobel Prize for that, for efforts in Iran. He said, well, if they cannot take that agreement, it's because they, who had proposed originally, the United States, basically in that case, it's because they cannot take yes for an answer. And another one, very respected journalist, Roger Cohen, again, it's no fan of Iran, I would say, he said something similar. They are changing the goalposts, so referring to the West. Well, that didn't go at that time, but we were, in a way, history makes its turns and comes and going. 1.5 years later, I was Minister of Defense then. I followed the subject. I didn't act on the subject, but I followed the subject. I remember that a lady called, whom I met later, actually had the opportunity to see her once in New York. Let me see her name. I'm getting old. Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was the planning advisor or head of the planning staff of Hillary Clinton. Towards the end of 2011, the pressure to bomb Iran was very strong. She wrote an article saying, well, we have to find a solution. Maybe it's time to look back into that agreement that the Turks and the Brazilians had proposed. So, and I'm not saying that they did exactly that, because the famous joint comprehensive plan of action is bigger in a way, but with a big difference also, which makes it much more complicated to verify. At the time that we made the agreement, estimates vary a little bit, but it is estimated that Iran had about 2,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium. When the JCPOA was signed, they had between 8,000 and 10,000. So it's a much more complex proposition anyway. But of course, I was very happy that it was signed in any case. But because the main thing that we showed, I think, with our effort with Iran, is that it was possible to negotiate. If you negotiate in good faith, it was possible. I remember some of my colleagues, including Hillary herself, saying, well, no, you know, the Iranians will only cheat you. They say one thing to you, they say another thing to the Chinese, but they know to whom they have said. They have to say precisely, and they have to say to the Atomic Agency in Vienna. Well, that's what they did. They put it precisely, and they wrote to the Atomic Agency in Vienna. But then the goalposts had changed. I have to say one thing. It is true that new problems appeared because Iran had started, that's another question, to have enrichment at 20%, which is, of course, already much more dangerous, and had also accumulated a bigger quantity of but two things. First, these were things that we could negotiate later on. And second, President Obama's letter to President Lula 3 weeks before our agreement didn't mention that. So he was saying, so I know someone who I won't mention the name, who I think might have been involved in the letter, and said, I know why you probably were involved in the letter. The person didn't say yes or no. So I said, I know why you proposed that letter, because you thought we would not obtain. You thought we would not get there. So it would be nice with us, because it seemed that they were supporting the Brazilian and Turkish effort to allies, to some extent at least, or to countries that are friendly with the United States, and at the same time, that wouldn't happen. But we got it. That was our main mistake, actually. That was not the idea. The idea was to prove that Iran is not reliable, and not to have the agreement. Fortunately, actually, the same arguments that were used against our declaration were later on used against Obama, by other people, by some people. So I'm not saying the agreement are exactly the same, because once again, the agreement now is a much broader one. But the other one was, let us say, the confidence-building gesture that would facilitate even further negotiations and diminish tensions 5 years before. Anyway, so these are 3 episodes in which Brazil participated very strongly in world affairs, in trade, in questions of peace and security, and I could mention many other aspects of our policies, which were very much criticized on top, most of all in Brazil. And there was a contradiction. Once imitating a speech that was made once, I believe, by, I don't know who was the first. There was a Russian foreign minister did that, but I think that then we had an ambassador in Washington that had done something similar. And I start reading the headlines about facts of Brazilian foreign policy. And I had the international headlines and the national headlines. And of course, the international headlines were incredibly more positive than the national headlines. Well, I was wrong, because the following day it was foreign minister profits the occasion of being in Senate to criticize the Brazilian media. So that's so there's no way that you can turn that around. So that's really what we try to do and working. So, I said, I just want to mention one thing, because that's very important. I emphasized the factors in Brazil that allowed for having a positive foreign policy. I mentioned the subjective factors. Of course, there are objective ones which were always there. I mean, Brazil is the 5th country in territory, the 5th in population. We have the largest number of borders with other countries in the world, except for China and Russia. And we are probably the only one with so many borders that haven't had a war for 150 years. We only participated in the Second World War because we joined the Allied cause. And it was the only Latin American country to do that with troops on the ground. So these are the objective facts, the subjective facts. But also the other thing is that in spite of the invasion of Iraq, which was very negative, of course, many reasons. One of them is the destruction of the structure of state, and now you have ISIS, and I think to a large extent that's the main cause. But the fact that it disrespected the charter of the UN, of course, was very serious. But in spite of that, there were signals that the world might become more multipolar, that we could have more centers of power, and that we could, in a way, work that, of course, multipolarity in itself is not a guarantee to peace, the same as the old balance of power in old Europe was not a guarantee to peace, but it gives more leeway to developing countries like Brazil. So what you have to have, and then I'll finish with that, you have to have, the ideal world is the one which is multipolar, but at the same time multilateral, which is not the same thing. Multipolar is, let us say, it's the de facto, it's the reality, the German, in German they would say Sein, no? And the multilateralism is Sollen, it's what it should be. So when you combine both, you may have a more stable world. And now a really defined world. Of course, there are many reasons for preoccupation in the world. Probably you have your own reasons for preoccupation. In Brazil, certainly, we are really, I don't know what will happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But I think that there is one thing that I want to emphasize. Sometimes the analysts here oversimplify things and give the impression that before the present administration, I'm not defending the present administration at all. I mean, I have my preferences. I'm a Brazilian and a minister, so I cannot say, but I have 2 daughters-in-law and 1 son-in-law who have dual nationality, and I gave them good advice, which unfortunately didn't work for. But anyway, I think. But it is an illusion to think that before the present administration here, we were living in a kind of liberal world order, a utopian one. Nothing like that. And when, for instance, you speak about the WTO that I mentioned, I have to say that the fragmentation started with initiatives of the United States, or other countries as well, but certainly the United States, in the previous government. So we have to take this into account, not to have the illusion that we were before in a kind of utopian liberal order that didn't exist. Maybe it existed from the point of view of Washington, maybe from Brussels, I don't know, but it didn't exist from the point of view of people in Africa, in Brazil, in South America, or in Asia, whatever. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, you can stay here, but I'm just going to ask people. So now we have some time for questions, and I would just like you, if you have a question, please come up to one of the microphones here to make your question. Actually, as people are going to the microphones, I'll start with one question. Going back to what you were saying about the integration in South America, because at the time it was a period in Latin America that they called the pink tide, where many governments of the region had elected leftist governments. And so I'm wondering, in the process of integration, did the fact that there were more left governments facilitate the integration? Was there a leftist orientation to that integration, or was it not an issue?
Well, I don't know if there was a pink tide or not. I mean, it's very difficult to describe that way. But what I can say is that if in our relations in integration, Colombia played an equally important role as played Venezuela. Maybe they were not so vocal, they didn't say, but at least we, I can say, gave as much attention to Colombia as we gave to Venezuela in the process of integration. We gave as much attention to Peru as we gave to, not to Bolivia in our case, because Bolivia is more linked to us because Brazil is dependent on Bolivia gas and other things. But no, I would not say that maybe some of these, let me put it in a different word, maybe instead of pink, but progressive governments had the integration more clearly in their programs or in their vision of the world. But if you go even to the statutes of UNASUR, which is the organization that appeared as a main organization that was new and it appeared as a result of that, it is emphasized the pluralism. Pluralism is emphasized as one aspect. And we were very, very clear about that we didn't want all the governments to necessarily go the same way. I mean, of course, there might be more sympathy for one or for another. But for instance, we were prepared to make concessions to Paraguay even before Lugo, when they had a conservative government. We were prepared to do concessions to Bolivia before. Well, maybe the fact that they were more active made it, urged us more, but no, I wouldn't say that. And our trade with Venezuela, for instance, it increased very much, but so did our trade with Colombia. And in a way, the trade with Colombia became relatively more balanced than the trade with Venezuela, in which Brazil continued to export much more. So I would not say that this was a main factor. Maybe to some, because you know, when we speak of right and left in South America or in Latin America, there is a different sense. For instance, the word nationalism, which became really very much of a bad word in the developed world generally, not only in the United States, but also especially populist nationalism in Europe, because it's anti-international, so to say. In South America, it's slightly different, because being nationalist means that you want to have more independence for your country, you're striving to have more autonomy. It has a different meaning. And you know, there are moments, if I take Brazilian history, in which nationalist presidents worked, not necessarily they were left wings. I mean, Vargas, for instance, he was very sympathetic to the fascism initially. Then he moved more to the democratic, and he was elected. But he kept this nationalist view, which implied, for instance, not participating in the Korean War, in spite of much pressure that Brazil should participate. Implied the creation of Petrobras, implied the creation of other important, our development bank, things like that. Also had a social content.
Thanks, Minister, for your very interesting talk. It's very illuminating. My question is actually also about Latin America and particularly the case of Venezuela. Venezuela is passing through a very problematic moment with a big question about what kind of authoritarianism we have there. And so I wonder if you have, what are your thoughts about the current situation of Venezuela, about the process that led Venezuela to be on that situation, and if there is anything that you would regret, perhaps of not being more forceful about some lines that Brazil would prefer not to be crossed by, particularly during the Maduro's government?
Well, I was not the foreign minister during the Maduro's government anyway, but I would say that the Venezuelan problem is for the Venezuelans to solve. I mean, we cannot solve the problems of Venezuela. The attempt that existed from outside was the attempted coup of 2002, which only made Chavez more radical, actually, more dependent even on his military bases. I can say this is not part of this book, but I have that book written, actually translated into Spanish, because it's published in Argentina as well, called Breves Narrativas Diplomáticas, short diplomatic narratives. And one of them, it's called A Group of Friends of the Venezuela, about a group of friends of the Venezuela, which Brazil created, or Brazil led, better said, and which included, by the way, let us say a social democrat government at the time of Chile, but it also included the United States, included Mexico, included two conservative governments of Portugal and Spain, because we thought it was impossible, it was necessary to talk to all people. And as I said, I mean, we cannot solve the problems of Venezuela, but we were able then, through dialogue, because the situation is not the same. I agree with you, and it's not the same for several reasons, including because of the oil prices are so low and so on. But when we came to government in 2003, the change from 2002 to 2003, Venezuela was going also through a very tough process of radicalization. Very tough. And I don't know, people can never say what would have happened, but many people said that it was on the verge of civil war. And Lula personally, and I myself at my level, but mostly Lula, put a lot of persuading effort to convince Chavez to call for the recall referendum, which is in the Constitution, which he did, by the way, and even to accept the Organization of American States supervision. And I remember even myself telling Chavez, with the permission of President Lula, of course, giving the famous example of the Caesar's wife. The Caesar's wife, so it's a very male chauvinist example, but that's how it runs in history. Caesar's wife is not, for Caesar, the wife of Caesar, it's not enough to be honest. She has to look honest. So that's why I remember telling this Chavez and as a kind of argument for having the OAS supervision. But now what do you have? At the time, we had a Colombian, as a former Colombian president, as OAS Secretary General. And Brazil has a lot of influence. Brazil is half of South America, so it has. And you had a president in Brazil that was trying to push for dialogue. Now, with the situation in which, I'm saying that with some regret because Almagro is my good friend. I like him very much. We work together in several places. He even invited me to be observer in Haiti. But sheer condemnation don't bring you anywhere. You may have your preference, you may express it in different ways, but if you want to influence the situation and you start by condemning totally one side and praising the other, you exclude yourself from the negotiation. And that's what happened now. I mean, I don't know what will happen. I think it's very difficult with the situation of Venezuela. I regret that very much. But there are things that probably are beyond our power. What I think we should try to find for Venezuela, as for other places where we have conflict or potential conflict, is dialogue. It's not simple. It's complex. I don't know. I don't have a magic solution. I think if you stay only in a, let us say, a binary relation of elections or non-elections, you will not find. Of course, I'm all in favor of elections. I mean, that's not the case. But maybe you have to have a broader agreement that some of the achievements claimed, at least, will not be affected. Because, mind you, I have visited Venezuela before, and I know that Venezuela is, there is actually a text by John Updike that someone quoted recently, which was his visit to Venezuela, and he first comes and deals with the middle class and the upper class, and he had the impression to be in a developed country, in a rich country, and then he go to one of these, I don't know, barrios, or whatever you call it in Spanish, in Portuguese is favelas, and then it was really not third, maybe almost fourth world country. And I come from a country where the favelas are very, very big. and lots of criminals and so on. But I had never seen a favela as big as that, that goes from the airport of Maiquetía to Caracas, continuous slum. So very big differences, and the elite in Venezuela itself was with very bad habits, I must say. I remember having visited Venezuela, that was the time of Caldera. Caldera was a kind of a Christian Democrat, moderate, social reformer maybe, very much against Cuba he was because of past experience, so could not be accused of being no radical. And our ambassador organized a lunch of business people there, and I participated. At a certain point, the businessmen who were there, I say men because they were all men, the businessmen who were there did not stop talking to me or to the ambassador and start talking among each other. And I perceived they were speaking about a conspiracy for a possible coup. And I said, well, my God, let me finish this. This is the Brazilian embassy. So, I mean, it is very difficult. And of course, the fact that the opposition in Venezuela accepted this idea of putschism in the beginning is a mark that's there. I agree that there had been many mistakes. If I had the chance, I would probably try to use this persuasive power. I can say that Brazil now has Brazil doesn't have much hard power, but has no soft power whatsoever to try to convince anyone, much less Maduro, of trying to expel Venezuela from Mercosur or suspend and so on. That doesn't help. That just radicalizes well, it's a difficult balance. You know, being tolerant is not maybe the ideal thing. But I remember, I can mention 2 or 3 things when this group of friends was created. Because the first idea of a group of friends came from Chavez himself. But the idea of group of friends of Chavez was Russia, China, Cuba, maybe Brazil, maximum. And so that I remember President Lula saying to him, he said, but Chavez, this is not a group of friends of Chavez, this is a group of friends of Venezuela, so you have to include a comprehensive group of countries. This is one example, and many others in which he used the persuasive power to convince. I spoke about the recall referendum, how it happened. 2 years later, he won the recall referendum, of course, as we know. 2 years later, there was a referendum on a constitutional amendment, which he lost, and he accepted. Well, then he tried to do maneuver. It's not perfect, but if you look around, I have to speak frankly here. I'm not only preoccupied with the situation in Venezuela, I'm very preoccupied with the situation in Brazil, because Brazil is the biggest country in South America, and what we have in Brazil now is very far from democratic. So we had to speak one minute about this thing about impeachment in Brazil. Impeachment seems a very legal and appropriate and legitimate process, but you in the United States will understand what I'm saying. I was here by coincidence at the time of Nixon, the process in Nixon, the attempt of the impeachment, and I was here also, at that time I was in Washington, and I was here also at the time that there was attempt of the impeaching President Clinton. And in either case, you could not imagine that, well, in the case of Nixon, he resigned, but even if you were impeached or resigning, that the change of government would be a total change of project. In other words, can you imagine that Nixon resigning, that Ford would ally with McGovern? That was not on the cards. Or could you imagine that if Clinton was impeached, that Al Gore would get allied with Jesse Helms? No, but that's what happened in Brazil. So that's exactly what happened in Brazil. It was a totally change of course based on a process that has many judicial, formally it was maybe the Supreme Court in Brazil accepted that it went on, but after all, the things that Dilma was accused were maybe some improprieties in terms of budgetary dealings, budgetary actions, the same that had been made before by Lula, by Cardoso, and by all the other presidents, and approved by our Court of Accounts. So that was used because they were looking for an opportunity to make Brazil change course. I tell you, the 2 things that normally make the Brazilian elite to react, which bothers them very much. 2 things, and the 2 things happen under Lula and Dilma in different proportions, maybe. One is to try to have an autonomous position in the world, because many people who are part of the elite have strong links it's their business, have strong links with outside capitals, external capitals. And the other thing is when you try to have social reforms. And when you have both at the same time, because you go to Brazil nowadays, and I go a lot to universities in Brazil, go much more now because I have more time, but anyway, I went before, I was professor also, not professor, lecturer in a university in Brasilia. The color of the students changed. The average color changed. And I'm sure that's to some extent true in Venezuela, I don't know, but certainly in Brazil it is. And so the combination of the social change, which was very important in Brazil, with an autonomous foreign policy. I would go to Iran, I would receive praise from people like Pickering. Nobody can say that Pickering is a pro-Iran or whatever, but in Brazil it would be criticized. Why meddle? I mean, that's not our business. Oh, yes, it is our business, because if there is a world war, it will affect us as well. So, anyway, so it's very difficult. Latin America, the main problem of Latin America, and South America more specifically, for which I can speak more, but I think, is inequality, the tremendous inequity of society. And you can't solve those problems. If you don't solve those problems, you'll have unstable governments necessarily. So you have to deal with two things at the same time. It's not easy, but maybe. I mean, I remember when I used to go to Cuba, if I may, just to Cuba very often. Not so often, but I went to Cuba several times, and many people say, no, we can accept reforms, but we have to keep the achievements of the revolution. Well, the achievements of the revolution, basically, that they used to say was, I mean, there are political aspects of it, mainly health and education for the poor people. And no, maybe some broader agreement that can encompass also some social aspects might be attempted. But, you know, you have to wish to do that. And I don't see the wish. I see, in the case of Brazil, the wish to condemn, because that is good for maybe electoral purposes or some other purposes.